Učitavani naši, dobar den. Na programata vo Fokus so Silvana Pavlovska. Danes je 14. januari 2025 godina i na site onije koji što go slavat naši od pravoslaven praznik Nova godina, koji što je danes ili Vasilica poznata međunarodot, bi sakla da vi go čestitam istiot i da vi posakam beričet na nova 2025 godina. Ova programa se emituva podolgo vreme. Programa koja što je posvetena na temi koji što nema da gi slušnete ili vidite vo drugite medijumi. Nešto koji što može bi mnogu novinari ili voditelji ne bi sakale da gi razgledat. Programata se emituva na makedonski jazik, a isto tako i se prenesuva i na anglijski jazik, zavisno od temata koja što ja razgleduvame. Deneska bi sakale da započneme jedna druga tema koja što verojatno ne vije toliko to jest je poznata, međutim ne bi je poznato ova za koje što ja danes bi sakala da spodelam s vas, a to je deka članak koji izleze na 14. dekembri 2018. godina na anglijski jazik so naslov Who has been meddling in Macedonia? Not only who you think. Autor na ovoj članak je Nicholas Leontopoulos. Ovoj članak izleze vo portalot taka narečen Investigate Europe. Znači, Investigate Europe se emediumot kada što ovoj članak na Nicholas Leontopoulos izleze, čiji naslov je Who's been meddling in Macedonia? Not only who you think. I zato, ke go emituvame, ke počneme da emituvame danes i ke bidi vo nekoliko delovi. Kako što rekov, to je na anglijski jazik i sega ja sa to nešto kego započnem. Se razbira se, to ova se pravi za vas, za da budeme informirani okolo mislenjata, okolo istražovanjata, okolo istorijata, povezana su naši od narod i naša tatkovina Makedonija. Greece and Macedonia were pressured by the United States, NATO, and the EU to sign a deal that most people in both countries reject. And yet, according to the narrative adopted by Western media, it was solely Russia who meddled, orchestrated, aggressed. Evidence on the ground shows a much more mixed and disturbing reality. For more than a quarter of a century, the Macedonian name issue has been arguably one of the most incomprehensible and, yes, boring issues in Europe. Until recently, it turned into a plot combining characters from Le Carre Cold War novels with a House of Cards script. Local politicians dangle with foreign ambassadors, street protesters collude with foreign oligarchs, hackers antagonize foreign spies. Greece and Macedonia had become the latest battlefield of the new Cold War between the West and Russia. Some of the world's best media rushed on the crime scene to cover it, and yet, as this piece will try to demonstrate, to a large extent, there was one-sidedness in answering the main question. Who made the mess? But first, and as short as possible, explain unto the issue itself. The name dispute between Greece and Macedonia is summarily dismissed by outsiders as sentimental. But for the two parties involved, it triggers existential fears. Macedonia, a new and tiny country, claimed that the name and identity are a matter of self-determination. Without them acting as a cementing glue, the fragile state might fall apart, given also that a quarter of its population is an Albanian ethnic minority. Greece, on the other side, argued that the name Macedonia and the Macedonian identity foment territorial pretensions over the northern Greek province of Macedonia, and that some of these pretensions are implied in the country's constitution. For more than 25 years, the two neighbors uh, failed to reach an agreement. But despite the stalemate, Athens and Skopje had learned to cope with the status quo, while at the same time enjoying an ever-growing economic relationship. Greece was content that official entities such as the European Union, the Council of Europe, and the United Nations recognized the country until only by its institutional name, FYROM, or former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. Macedonia was content that over 130 countries recognized the name Macedonia, and that was also the name used by all media, save the Greek ones. It's all about Russia. Around 2016, things abruptly changed. This time it was the outsiders that urgently wanted the issue to be resolved. What had changed? The West wanted to add Macedonia as one more member in its military alliance, NATO. But for this to happen, the neighbors needed first to resolve the name issue. According to the Western narrative, this would help contain Russia's interference and aggression in the region. According to the Russian narrative, this was yet another aggressive step taken by the West to encircle Russia, breaking promises made at the end of the Cold War that NATO would not expand eastwards. The Macedonian issue became just another episode in the Cold War between Russia and the West. George Soros, the controversial American hedge fund billionaire turned philanthropist, set the record straight in a New York Times op-ed. Solving the Macedonia dispute is all about broader geopolitics and Russia. It's about making the Balkan states, as Soros wrote, less susceptible to influence, economic, diplomatic, or military, from Beijing, Ankara, or Moscow. A deal against the will of the people in both countries. Following pressure to both sides from the West and after months of secret name negotiations, Greece and Macedonia reached a final agreement. The two PMs brought to their peoples and their parliaments, until that moment kept in the absolute dark, an agreement that suited perfectly the geopolitical objectives of the United States, the European Union, and NATO, but was extremely unpopular with their own people. According to the latest poll in Greece, the Prespa agreement is supported by Miagra, 17% against the 65% who reject it. In Macedonia, the unpopularity of the agreement was proven by the failure of the referendum, despite the promise that was attached to it. Voting yes in the referendum would be the ticket for FYROM's entry in NATO and eventually to the EU. In June 2018, the agreement was signed by PM Zaev and Tsipras at the Lake of Prespa. According to the Prespa agreement, Greece would be obliged to accept the existence of a Macedonian nationality and a Macedonian language. Last but not least, Greece, a full member of NATO, would agree not to veto Northern Macedonia's entry in the military alliance. Macedonia, from its side, would be obliged to change its name to Northern Macedonia and delete from its constitution all irredentist references. There was, however, a caveat. For the Prespa agreement to be valid, it had to be adopted first by a referendum in Macedonia. 50 Shades of Meddling. The referendum was scheduled for September, and in the months preceding it, Macedonia became the theater for the new Cold War. But here's another oddity, this time not Balkan. The Western media, especially the Anglo-Saxon, were rife with allegations about Russia meddling, according to Reuters, interfering, according to Wall Street Journal, exercising influence through corruption, according to Foreign Policy, funding violence, Times of London, orchestrating to wreck the Telegraph, and slapping Washington Press or Washington Post. Yet the same media, while claiming they're independent as opposed to Russia's propagandist state media, stood silent when it came to the West, US, EU, and NATO role in the conflict. There was Russia meddling, no doubt about it. In July 2018, a few weeks after the signing of the Prespa Agreement, Greece, historically much more reluctant than its European counterparts to take strong steps against Moscow, expelled two Russian diplomats. Athens accused Moscow of attempts to bribe state officials and to interfere in its internal affairs. The Russian efforts, according to the Financial Times, were focused on bribing local government officials, Orthodox clergymen, and members of the cultural associations and far-right groups at the north of the country in order to bolster opposition against the name agreement. US spycraft against Ivan, the oligarch. A few days later, on July the 17th, more evidence of Russia meddling surfaced. Ivan Sevidis, a Russian businessman of Greek origin with rapidly growing financial interests in Greece's economy, that is the ports, the media, and the football or the soccer, was accused of covertly channeling payments of 300,000 to 350,000 euros to opponents of the name agreement. The Savidi story was first revealed by OCCRP, an investigative reporting outlet. Trying to undermine the credibility of the scoop, detractors of the Prespa Agreement were pointed to the fact that OCCRP receives state funding by the United States. Several months later, a new story about Sevidis' actions, this time inside Greece, broke in the New York Times. As it turns out, the irrefutable evidence upon which Greece based its decision to expel the Russians was the product of US spycraft. It consisted of intercepted communications by the US in Greece that showed that Mr. Savidis was working as Russia's conduit. It was also based on financial data collected by American agencies that showed Savidis had been paying the protesters. According to the NYT, the Americans turned over the intercepts to the Greek Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras, who responded by making a rare break with Moscow. Sevidis versus Soros, the symmetry. In the eyes of the West, Sevidis' soft power initiatives in the region have turned him into an agent of, as the New York Times put it, Russian subversion. The analogy with George Soros is worth noting. Soros and Savidis are different figures and of a different caliber. However, the way they were perceived by their detractors presents an intriguing symmetry. A foreign billionaire and philanthropist who's accused of using his wealth to provoke unrest, influence elections, and destabilize democracies. Even the allegations are symmetrical. Both were accused by successive prime ministers of Macedonia of financially supporting the protests against them. First, it was the PM Gruevski, who in 2015 to 2017 repeatedly accused Soros of funding protests in collusion with the US in order to foment regime change. And now it was the turn of PM Zaev to make an almost identical allegation, but against the other side, against Savidis as a businessman sympathetic to the Russian cause. There is one difference, though. Soros's funding via his Open Society Foundation is seemingly transparent as opposed to the other opaque structure of the Ivan Savidis Charitable Foundation, dead link referred to from his Persona webpage. Nevertheless, the parallel between Savvidis and Soros begs a question of double standards. If one is well-intentioned benefactor, both are philanthropists, then how can the other one be a dark force agent, a dark force agent of a foreign power, and vice versa? How the West fares. The allegations about Savvidis' actions and Russian meddling seem plausible, albeit with a grain of salt, given that all evidence is sourced back to Western intelligence services, whose record regarding accuracy of information is far from impeccable. But how has the West fared in regards to its own measure of meddling? For a start, we know by their own admission that the US agencies have been conducting illegal intercepts in an allied country, Greece, against foreign nationals, and then passed on this intelligence to achieve the expulsion of diplomats of a third country, Russia. I think we will end it here for today, and we will continue shortly with the remainder of this article, which is written by Nicholas Leontopoulos and published by Investigate Europe on the 14th of December 2018, the title of it being Who's Been Meddling in Macedonia? Not only who you think. Let us now play a little bit of music and we'll end today's episode of In Focus with Silvana Pavlovska. Thank you for listening to In Focus, and I'm looking forward to seeing you shortly. Cheers. Very well. So then now we are going to continue with the second part of the news article published by Investigate Europe, I beg your pardon, the title of which is Who's Been Meddling in Macedonia? Not Only Who You Think, by Nicholas Leontopoulos, published on the 14th of December 2018. As I've said in the beginning of the first session, this broadcast serves for the purpose of informing you, okay? Not providing an opinion. It's up to you to decide what you think of this writing. It's for me to present it to you in the way that it's been written. So let's have a look. American diplomacy has played a lead role. I shall read that again. American diplomacy has played a lead role. The US doesn't hide its own meddling. In his August 2018 testimony before the Senate's Foreign Relations Committee, Wes Mitchell, US Assistant Secretary of State, said that American diplomacy has played a lead role in resolving the Greece-Macedonia name dispute. And there is a PDF file attached to this article, PDF of Mitchell's testimony. We will also include that in the next episode. For now, we shall just continue. American diplomacy has played a lead role. Mitchell's testimony reads like a hardcore relic of Cold War tactics. To face Russia in an effective way, Mitchell says, and we quote, US diplomacy must be backed by military power that is second to none and fully integrated with our allies and all of our instruments of power, end of quote. Mitchell said that the State Department takes the Russia threat very seriously, quoting, countering it in both overt and covert form, close of quote. An indication of this, quote again, all 49 US missions located in Europe and Eurasia are required to develop, coordinate, and execute tailored action plans for rebuffing Russian influence operations in their host countries. End of quote. The price tag. It is hard to attach a price tag next to this commitment, but according to the New York Times, the US Congress has allocated $8 million specifically for Macedonia, quote, to fight Russian disinformation campaigns, end of quote. Additionally, the US provided Macedonia with an extra $2 million to, quote, promote the rule of law, end of quote, in the country. PM Zaev has recently said that the amount the US government has spent to promote democracy in the country is more than 1.75 billion US dollars. From Kiev to Athens, Mitchell's testimony was celebrated on Twitter by US Ambassador in Athens, Jeffrey Pyatt, who, according to the New York Times, had been instrumental in the expulsion of Russian diplomats from Greece. When Pyatt talks about playing, quote, a lead role in other countries' affairs, he knows what he's talking about. Before moving to Athens, Pyatt was the US ambassador in Ukraine. In an intercepted telephone conversation from 2014, almost certainly leaked by Russian secret services, Pyatt is heard in an exchange with Victoria Nuland, Assistant Secretary of State, on moving top Ukrainian politicians of the opposition inside and outside the Kiev government as if they were, quote, pieces on a chessboard. There is a full transcript by BBC, and we may be also able to broadcast this on another occasion. British PR agencies to infiltrate and divide. A fragment of what this covert form of action in Macedonia might consist of was revealed in a groundbreaking investigation by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. It revealed that British PR agencies were hired by the Yes camp, which was supported by the Macedonian government and by the US-EU-NATO alliance, to influence voters in, quotation, under the radar operations and to create misleading social media accounts to infiltrate and divide the opposition. One of the British firms was funded by the Foreign Office for its work there. And yet, despite the Bureau being considered a credible and independent investigative outlet, its scoop about concrete actions by the West to meddle in Macedonia's politics had no traction in Western media. A parade of statesmen. There was also overt action. In the weeks preceding the referendum, Macedonia witnessed an unprecedented parade of some of the most powerful people in the West. On the 6th of September, NATO's chief Stoltenberg. On the 7th of September, Austria's Chancellor Kurz. Austria holds the EU presidency. On the 8th of September, Germany's Chancellor Merkel. On the 9th of September, US Senator Johnson. On the 13th of September, EU High Representative Mogherini and US Assistant Secretary of State Mitchell. On the 17th of September, US Defense Secretary Mattis. And on the 18th of September, EU Commissioner Hahn all visited Skopje to bolster the yes vote. It was a typical carrot and stick approach. The Western statesmen and women alternated praise and promises with veiled threats and ultimatums. So, who won the referendum? The first impression in the referendum of 30th of September that the yes vote had won was just an illusion. The opposition had called its supporters to boycott the referendum. The turnout, 37%, fell far short of the 50% required by the country's constitution for the referendum to be declared valid. The opposition celebrated while some pundits estimated it was time to bury the deal. And yet a significant part of the Western press had a different perception of reality. According to the tweet by the Financial Times, quote, voters overwhelmingly, end of quote, supported PM Zaev's proposal, backed by a long article that failed to refer to the constitutional threshold. Readers were left with the impression that the yes vote won. No, said columnist Simon Tisdall in The Guardian. Neither yes nor the no won because the result of the referendum is another victory for Russia, and Western leaders were outmaneuvered by Moscow. This editorial line is deeply problematic. Voters are infantilized, I beg your pardon. Either they vote as we wish, in this case as NATO wishes, or if they vote differently, then this must be happening because they were brainwashed by Moscow or Russians hacked the elections. This line of thinking becomes a worrying pattern from Trump's election to Brexit, to the French and Italian elections, suspicions of Kremlin ties to Le Pen and Salvini, and now to Macedonia. Fact-checking Russia's dirty tricks. So what has been the impact of Russia's dirty tricks? For example, fake news factories, propaganda Facebook groups in the Macedonian referendum. The West's suspicions about Russia meddling are reinforced by a true yet not so relevant story. In 2016, it was reported that a fake news factory was operating from a tiny Macedonian village, Veles, where students had been fabricating fake news stories in the US presidential race, favoring candidate Trump. Yet there are two buts in that story. According to Bloomberg, there was never an established link between that fake news factory and the Russia interests. Never was it established, this link. Even those who hyped the votes fake news, the Veles fake news, even those who hyped the Veles fake news story as a factor in the US election concede that there was no trace of fake news factory, Russian or not, sprawling in the Prespa agreement affair. Digital Forensic Research Lab, or DFR Lab, a NATO-affiliated project that tracks disinformation across Europe, concluded that stories by Russian state-funded media, quotation, pushing one-sided narratives, end of quotation, ahead of the September 30th referendum had generated nothing but low traction in the country. Vladimir Petresky, a researcher working for the DFR Lab, told Bloomberg that there has been no explosion of new fake news websites as there was during the 2016 US election, end of quote. The same lack of any indication, Russian or other, foul play applies to Facebook groups. Petresky from DFR Lab, again, quotation, the main Facebook group for the boycott has fewer than 11,000 followers, not many for a country with 1 million Facebook accounts, a close of quote. An offer they can't refuse. The referendum fiasco meant that the Prespa agreement had either to be buried or to have it adopted by the Skopje parliament, where the government lacked the required two-thirds majority to pass the deal. The conservative opposition remained equivocally against it, and 8 crucial MP votes were missing. A senior Greek politician said, now it's up to the embassies to raise their game. A new round of pressure started, but this time the gloves were off. On October the 8th, the European Union Commissioner for European Enlargement, Johannes Hahn, appeared optimistic in an interview to Austrian newspaper Kurier, interview with German, and we have that interview as well, which we're hoping to be able to play for you on another occasion, because only 8 or 9 opposition votes are needed. So how to secure the votes? I believe in the combination of the Balkan and rational approach, Hahn said to the Courier. The US are disappointed. Disappointed is in quotations. On October the 10th, according to a source from the European People Party, EPP, President Joseph Daul had a phone conversation with Christian Mickoski, leader of the opposition party VMRO de PMNE, that had governed the country from 2004 to 2016. Daul warned him in an undiplomatic manner that if VMRO didn't vote in favor of the Prespa agreement, the party, and we quote, would bear full responsibility for the consequences. End of quote. On October the 16th, Assistant Secretary of State Wes Mitchell, in a letter published by the Embassy of the US in Skopje, Macedonia, wrote to the leader of the opposition in Macedonia that the US, quote, have been disappointed with the positions of VMRO de PMNE leadership, end of quote. Finally, on October the 19th, the parliament was summoned to vote. The government froze the procedure for 10 hours as it struggled to find the 8 missing votes. And then, late at night, a miracle happened. 8, not 9 or 10 or 11 MPs changed their mind despite their party line and voted in favor of the deal. Blackmail and bribes. What happened? We will probably never know. Some of the country's top political figures spoke openly of blackmail and bribes. So did Russia, unable to hide its bitterness at the outcome. Out of the 8 MPs who switched side at the very last moment, 3 were released from house arrest prior to the vote. The government dismissed rumors that it would trade off the votes of another 2 MPs by providing them amnesty from charges they're facing. But as this article went online on December the 13th, the government pushed forward with a selective amnesty law, thus making it more likely that an under-the-table bargaining of the votes had indeed taken place. And what about the remaining 3 MPs? Igor Yanushev, Secretary General of the opposition VMRO de PMNE party, claimed that 3 MPs had been offered bribes of between 250,000 and 2 million euros. One of the party's vice presidents, Mitko Yanchev, was dismissed, quote, for organizing a group to pressure, blackmail, threaten, and bribe VMRO de PMNE legislators, end of quote. A great day for democracy, in quotation. Both the US and the EU, so vocal against violations of the rule of law in Hungary, remain silent in this case or even celebratory of the process. A great day for democracy in Skopje, tweeted Commissioner Hahn. A great day for democracy in Skopje, MK. I congratulate all those who decided to walk on along the EU path. I expect that the free choice of all MPs is fully respected, especially of those who crossed the aisle tonight. We need statesmanship, not party games, said Johannes Hahn on October the 19th, 2018. Allegations by VMRO officials about the MPs being bribed can be routinely dismissed given the VMRO has lost its credibility after years of corrupt governing. Its former leader and Macedonia's former MP, Nikola Gruevski, or PM, I should say, not MP, PM, Prime Minister Nikola Gruevski, was recently granted asylum by Viktor Orban's Hungary to avoid imprisonment in Macedonia. However, what seems to be forgotten is that, quotation, corrupt and nationalist, end of quote, Gruevski was for years the West's politician of choice in Macedonia, hailed as a pro-European reformer, a staunch Euro-Atlantic ally, and the man who solved North Europe's migration problem by shutting the Balkan route. All that before geopolitics changed the tide. Unfinished business. The Atlantic Council, a NATO-affiliated think tank, has been quite present in the Macedonian issue, resuscitating a Cold War vocabulary 30 years after the fall of the Iron Curtain. In an event about Macedonia on October the 22nd, Damon Wilson, the Atlantic Council's vice president, said, we quote, "The free world is facing a pretty serious challenge from an alternative model of growing authoritarianism. A key to pushing back against this threat is resolving the unfinished business, Wilson argued, and there's clearly unfinished business in Southeastern Europe. Matched with Russia's similarly belligerent statements and given the legacy of both camps conducting business in the neighborhood, this is a bad omen for what comes next. Disclaimer. Investigate Europe is partially funded by George Soros' Open Society Foundation. Opinions expressed in this article are those of the author and do not necessarily reflect the position of all members on Investigate Europe. So that was an article which I've read to you in full as it is written and published in the Investigate Europe. The author is Nicholas Leontopoulos, the publishing date 14th of December 2018, and it's titled, Who's Been Meddling in Macedonia? Not Only Who You Think. Here we are. And so we shall end today's session. I thank you for watching the In Focus with Silvana Pavlovska, a YouTube channel where we are not afraid of bringing to your attention matters that are important to you in our view, matters to consider and perhaps discuss amongst yourselves and decide what you wish to do about it. So thank you once again for watching In Focus with Silvana Pavlovska. I will see you soon.